Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Bell, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today for Wildflowers and Reeds, Exploring What Native Means. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through the sales and renewals of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. And you can see here our previous plate, and it got an update a few years ago. These funds, along with donations and membership, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the state wildflower license plate. And if you purchase or have the plate, you're eligible for a membership. So just let us know and we will get you set up in our database. Also, be sure to check out our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, and for upcoming events and more. We're also on social media, and you can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our next webinar in March will be From Bunkers to Butterflies, Conservation of South Florida's Lepidoptera at Zoo Miami's Butterfly Lab, presented by Zoo Miami Conservation and Research Specialist Tiffany Moore on Wednesday, March 20th at 2 p.m. This webinar will cover Florida's many endangered and imperiled butterflies and moths and how we can help in their conservation. We also have some great field trips coming up in 2024, our next being on Saturday, March 2nd at Jordan Scrub Sanctuary, led by our own Jenny Ryan, and searching for butterworts, grass pink orchids, and other early spring blooms. In April, we'll tour the Alachua County Lowlands Preserve with Ryan Means of the Coastal Plains Institute, and registration for this trip opens to the public on Monday. So be sure to follow us on socials, subscribe to our newsletter, or check out flawildflowers.org/events to stay in touch with what we've got going on. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started today. All attendees are muted with cameras off. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. The chat is active, but we don't monitor it for questions. You've got to use that Q&A box. We will address questions at the end of the talk as time permits. And if your question is not answered, you can email it to info@flawildflowers.org. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel in 24 to 48 hours. When it is available, you will receive an email with a link to the recording, along with a resource page with links from the webinar. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, a friend and previous colleague of mine, Marc Frank, who is a lifelong plant enthusiast who completed the Florida Master Gardener training in Alachua County in 2002 and has an MS in horticultural science from the University of Florida. He has worked as a manager of the nursery at Singapore Botanic Gardens and as a botanist at the Florida Department of Agriculture. Currently, he is the assistant collection manager and extension botanist at the University of Florida Herbarium, which is the botanical collection of the Florida Museum of Natural History. Marc manages the herbarium's plant identification and information service, which serves IFAS research and extension personnel, U.S. faculty, and other clients throughout the state. He has a particular interest in horticultural taxonomy and the identification and classification of cultivated plants. Marc is just an incredible resource for us here in the state of Florida. And without further ado, actually, I am going to have one ado. We would love to know kind of where in the state you guys are all joining us from today. So if you have a moment as we're switching over between our slides and Marc's, please pop your county or city in the chat box. Thanks so much. And I will hand it over to Marc. All right, looks good, Marc. You're up. Thank you.
So thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm really excited to see how many people have logged on. I don't know if this is normal for your webinars, but over 200 people is fantastic. So I'm really thrilled to see how much interest there is in this subject. So as Emily mentioned, just as a little background, so you know where I'm coming from on this topic, I manage a plant identification and information service that primarily serves all of the extension agents in the various IFAS county extension offices. And so we have offices in almost every county in the state of Florida that is equipped to deal with homeowner questions as well as questions that come from agricultural producers. And those might be people growing livestock, turf grass, vegetable crops, flowers, fruit, you name it. So the idea is that I am a specialist who uses the herbarium's collections at the University of Florida as a resource to answer questions for this broad clientele. And what I often get with questions for ID is, what is this plant? And then in the very same breath, the next question, is this plant native? And what I quickly learned when I started responding to these types of questions is that people made an assumption that we know, that we always know with a particular plant species whether it is native or not. And that's simply not the case. I mean, sometimes it's really clear, but sometimes it's really not clear. And what's more, sometimes botanist opinions change over time. So a species might have been viewed as being native in the past and is now considered exotic, or vice versa. So this presentation was really developed specifically to kind of help break down some people's assumptions and help them understand a little more about the nuance of this topic. So specifically, what I'm hoping to accomplish today is to talk more about the definitions that are used for the term native, and then to look at the various ways that botanists determine if a particular plant species is native to the state of Florida or not. Then we're going to look at some examples of recent status changes, both plants that were considered to be native and now considered to be exotic, and vice versa. And then we're going to talk about some things to consider when you are purchasing and gardening with Florida native plants or using them in restoration projects. So what do we mean by native? There's a really good publication by Basil Iannone and his colleagues on the IFAS Invasive Species Council. And they use the definition that you see on your screen, a species that occurs naturally in a specified geographic area. Now, that Iannone article that I'm citing actually provides concise definitions for 7 different terms used in discussing plant invasion and plant and animal invasion. And there was really a very specific intention behind it, which was to facilitate unified messaging between extension personnel and all of their different stakeholders. So it was basically an effort on the part of IFAS to come up with a unified terminology that all of us who work within the IFAS umbrella can use when we're very clear in communicating about native and invasive with our clients. Now, what you often hear when people are talking about native as a point of convenience is they say in North America, plants are defined as being native. They were here at the time of European contact and settlement. And that is a convenient definition, but perhaps not the most useful. And there's a couple issues with it. One is it really depends where in North America you're talking about. So if we're up in Newfoundland, well, there was Norse contact and actually a Norse settlement in Newfoundland in 1021 AD. And then you come all the way down the east coast of Florida, and the Spanish actually had a settlement at St. Augustine at 1565. So that's a 500-year time period, which is pretty significant. But what I like even less about this definition of a plant being native when it was here at the time of European contact and settlement is that what about other continents? Like, what if you're talking about a plant native to Europe? Obviously, European settlement is like a poor definition. So depending whether you're talking about the continent of Africa, South America, North America, Asia, it seems like contact is not what we really want to be using as our point of reference. So the idea really is that a native species is one that naturally occurs in a particular region, state, ecosystem, or habitat without the actions of humans, whether they are intentional human, purposeful introduction or unintentional introduction. So the definition that you see here on the screen that was put out by the Federal Native Plant Conservation Committee in 1994, a species that occurs naturally in a particular region, state, ecosystem, or habitat without direct or indirect human actions. So the idea behind this definition is really a plant that has evolved and adapted to a specific location or ecosystem over millennia and has not been genetically altered by people. Now, there's a lot of debate about the time frame over which species arise. And for microorganisms, for things like bacteria and viruses, you can have species evolution happening in a shorter time frame. So perhaps in a human observable time frame, you can have bacteria and viruses evolve. But generally with plants and animals, the thought is that species evolve on a scale of hundreds of thousands to several million years. And so the idea behind that native definition is it's something that has really evolved a complex series of relationships with other organisms in an ecosystem over a very long period of time. The other thing I should mention is that when we're talking about animals, certainly humans have bred and selected some groups of animals like livestock and pet. But in general, human impacts on the genetics of animals is much less than plants. Humans have been modifying plants for a really long time, and it's a really hard thing for us to get at. So there has been subtle selection of plants for specific desirable attributes or modifications of landscapes for as long as there's been humanoid organisms on the planet. And so it can be very difficult to get at whether a particular plant species is truly genetically unaltered by humans, because we have had such a profound impact on our landscapes and on the plants that we use and on the preferences of those plants through our modification of the landscape. Okay, so the important thing to really wrap your head around is every plant species is native to somewhere. So when you just say a plant is native, that's very vague. What you really need to use is a geographic point of reference. So is it native to Eastern North America, native to the Southeastern US, native to Florida, native to North Florida, native to a specific county? And so this also applies to the term invasive, that a plant that might be invasive here in Florida is going to be native someplace else. So with the terms native and invasive, it is most informative if you use them with a geographic point of reference. Now, having said that, plant species aren't confined by geographic borders. Plants don't care if this is North Florida or South Georgia. plant species are really confined by ecosystem and habitat conditions. Okay. That is climate, soil, water, what herbivores are present, the fire, hydrodynamics, everything about the ecosystem. So our geographic borders are a convenient point of reference because it's something we're all familiar with. But really, when I'm communicating with people about a point of reference, I will say, this species is native to fire-prone pine ecosystems in the southeastern U.S. And then there's no vagueness. I'm not just talking about the general southeastern U.S., and it could be in any ecosystem. Okay, so I recently became aware of an idea that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. There is a researcher who's really well known and very well thought of named Neil Anderson, who's at the University of Minnesota. And he is working on some species that are in the upper Midwest where the genetic data, their molecular data, seems to indicate that the plants are really native to the area. But the plants are behaving very aggressively and having a lot of ecosystem impacts in terms of altering the ecology of areas and also displacing other native species. So Anderson has recently done some webinars and publications where he's argued that it is possible for a species to be both native and invasive. And this is really a direct contrast with the IFAS article that I mentioned early, Unknown et al., where the idea was really that a plant has to be exotic to be invasive. So in the IFAS article, we would use the term nuisance for a plant that is native but behaving aggressively and having impacts. Anderson is arguing that we've got a lot of baggage that we are bringing to these terms native and exotic, and that we're making assumptions that everything that is native is good, and everything that is exotic doesn't belong. But then when it comes down to it, 95% of the plant foods that we're eating are of exotic origin. And we are so dependent on exotic species for food, fiber, fuel, wood, so many different ways. And there are certainly plenty of exotic species that have ecosystem or economic value. So it's tempting to have those connotations associated with this terminology: native, good, exotic, perhaps not so good. But what I'd like to introduce as a possibility is that we bring a little more awareness to this, that perhaps there are some native species that really can be problematic, particularly in the disturbed habitats that us humans are so good at creating. And that conversely, it is really possible that some exotic species can have really valuable ecosystem services that they provide. And we as scientists need to get better at evaluating species on a case-by-case basis, regardless of whether they are native or non-native, and kind of understanding how they interact with other organisms in the ecosystem and what kind of services they do provide to the ecosystem. So in a lot of the research that has been done on this idea of ecosystem services, I think there is some bias that has affected it where there's been an implicit assumption that the native species offer more ecosystem services, and I'm not sure that that's really going to be borne out by the research. Okay, so enough of that. Where do we go to find out if a plant species is native? I don't know if you guys are aware of the Atlas of Florida plants. Hopefully, a lot of you are. The Atlas is just a fabulous resource. And to be honest, most other states in the US do not have an atlas the way we do in Florida. So there's an Alabama plant atlas. A few other states have plant atlases, but we are so fortunate because the Institute of Systematic Botany at the University of South Florida has maintained this website for almost two decades now, maybe a little more than 2 decades. And they've had dedicated staff updating it. So in some states, for example, at Georgia, they started a Georgia Plant Atlas, but they didn't have dedicated staff and they didn't have the resources to maintain it. And now it's fallen by the wayside. So when people ask me, where should I go to find out if a plant is native? The first thing that I mention is the Atlas of Florida Plants. Now, here you see a profile page for a particular species, the cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis. And what you'll see here on the left is the plant family, the scientific name, the common name, and just below that, the status. And you can see here that they indicate on the atlas it's native, but they're also telling you that it is listed as threatened by the Florida Department of Agriculture. And then we've got some other information that it's an obligate wetland plant, a facultative wetland plant. So interesting information readily available right off the species profile page. And then the other thing to know about the Atlas of Florida Plants is that they provide distribution maps that show you all the counties for which a specimen has been collected and deposited in an herbarium. So those are the counties that are in green. So you can see here on this demonstration map, distribution map, that Lobelia cardinalis occurs throughout the Panhandle of Florida down to the Central Peninsula. Now, what I want to point out is we've got several counties that are not in green. We've got Gadsden County, I think that's Lafayette County right there, Baker County, Union County. Just because those counties aren't green doesn't mean that that species isn't native to those counties. It just means that a botanist hasn't gotten around to pressing a voucher specimen and depositing it in an herbarium. So in this particular case, since cardinal flower has been found in all the contiguous counties, there's a very high likelihood that it is present and native in Gadsden County as well. So the map can be useful in seeing how contiguous the distribution of a particular species is. And as I'm going to discuss later on, can help to inform whether a botanist thinks a species is native to a particular part of the state or not. Okay, so first resource I would recommend would be for checking if a plant species is native to Florida is the Atlas of Florida Plants. Just keep in mind that the atlas only includes those species that are either native or exotic species that have been introduced and become established in the wild. So if an exotic species is only known in cultivation in Florida, it won't be listed on the Atlas website. The Atlas website only includes species that are native or introduced and established. Now, another great resource which has come online in the past few years is the Flora of the Southeastern U.S., which was developed by Alan Weekly and his colleagues at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I really like this website a lot. And there's multiple reasons. One is that their distribution map has more nuance to it. And by more nuance, what I mean is that they're using this graphic representation with different symbols. And you can see a key here in the, which I'm going to show you in just a second, telling you what the symbols are. And so that helps indicate whether a species is rare, uncommon, common, native, or exotic in different parts of the southeastern US. So here's what I was talking about, is the nuance that in this distribution map, they have different symbols to indicate whether a species is native, perhaps exotic, definitely exotic, and then the relative commonness, whether something is rare to very common. So then when we go back a slide and look at this distribution map for Coreopsis lanceolata, what we can see is that where it's native and common is those areas with a black squaring, so you can really get a sense that the greatest center of diversity for this is in the middle lower south. And then when we're getting to Central Florida, that there may be some question as to whether this species is really native or perhaps exotic. And similarly, when we're getting to the northern extent of the range for Coreopsis lanceolata, it's almost certain that it was introduced when we get towards the mid-Atlantic region. So I really like the weeklies Flora of the Southeastern US because it does bring this level of detail that we don't yet have on the Atlas of Florida plants. And the other thing that I love about the Weeklies Flora website is that they've got some discussion in terms of habitat, that they're telling you habitat preferences. So in this case, for Coreopsis lanceolata, they're telling you open sandy prairies, but also in, as it moves east in the range, showing up in disturbed areas. So it's a great resource to use, but I have to confess that because there is this this difference in symbols, you often have to like spend a little more time looking at it and figuring out exactly what it means. Okay, so now let's take an example of a Florida plant. I imagine that most of you are familiar with this beautiful flower that's shown in the lower right, Echinacea purpurea, the eastern purple coneflower. And I frequently hear this species touted as a Florida native. Now, when we look at the Atlas of Florida plants, which is the distribution map on the upper right, what you can see is that eastern purple coneflower has only been vouchered from Gadsden County. And this is from the Apalachicola Bluffs, the Chattahoochee Bluffs, which really drains. It's a drainage system that comes from the Piedmont area up near Atlanta. So what we're seeing is that the eastern purple coneflower really doesn't seem to be native to the lowland coastal plain habitats that are so common in the state of Florida. So I find that interesting in and of itself, just looking at the atlas. But then when we look at the weekly map, what we see, if we just zero in on the areas where it is native and common, what we can see is that for this eastern purple coneflower, it's really a upland, upper middle south species. And as we move south, it becomes less common. And as we move east, particularly getting to the mid-Atlantic region, it looks like there's a very strong possibility that it's introduced. That is all the areas where you see a diamond or triangle. So in Florida, in the Panhandle, yes, it is probably native to uncommon upland habitats in Jackson, Liberty, Gadsden counties, but probably only to those areas. Now, is Eastern purple coneflower a beautiful plant? Undoubtedly. Is it attractive to pollinators? Undoubtedly. Should you be growing it in your garden? Maybe. Depends where you live, right? If you're close to the coast and gardening in Manatee County or South Florida, it might be a pretty tough plant to grow. So what I'm getting at is that blanket thing of saying, oh yeah, purple coneflower is native to Florida. Well, maybe it's native to, maybe we need to put more finesse into it. Maybe we need to say native to upland habitats of North Florida. But there's nothing bad about gardening it. But if you're a gardener and you want to succeed with it, and you're gardening in the southern part of the state in very sandy soils, maybe it's going to be harder to be successful with it. Okay, so now let's get into this idea of lines of evidence, how botanists determine if a particular species is native or not. I think it really comes as a surprise to a lot of people to learn that it's not always clear that the native status of some species. Certainly, with most plants, we know, is it native or is it exotic? But there's a subset of species that are very common and widespread, often have a tendency to be in disturbed habitats, and it can be really hard to determine whether they're actually native or not. So in these cases, botanists tend to look at multiple types of evidence, and these include specimens that are deposited in herbaria, published floras, early explorer and naturalist accounts, paleontological or archaeological remains, distributional information, and the types of habitats that the plants occur in. And I'm going to mention and discuss each of these lines of evidence separately. So herbarium specimens are near and dear to my heart. And obviously, since I work in an herbarium, I feel very comfortable mining this type of data for information. In this case, we see a herbarium specimen that was collected by a German botanist named Ferdinand Rugel, who collected all through the southeastern US from the early 1840s to the 1860s. And so this is a plant that was collected by Rugel between Quincy and Ospelaga in Gadsden County, Florida in 1843. So that's pretty darn cool, right? This is a plant specimen that is 180 years old, 181 years old, and still looking pretty good. And so the idea is here in Florida, our earliest specimens date back to 1800s. But when we look at some of the herbaria in Europe, there are older herbarium specimens from Florida and the Southeast, particularly at some of the older institutions in the UK and mainland Europe, the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew, the British Museum of Natural History, the big herbarium at Vienna, in Germany, and so on. And so there we're able to push back to 1700s and sometimes even late 1600s to get at whether particular plant species were found in certain parts of the Southeast. So the beauty to having an herbarium specimen as opposed to having something mentioned in a book or in a traveler's account is that with a physical specimen, you can look at it and actually confirm that the person identified it correctly. Because botanists make mistakes, right? So it could be that someone could come along and look at this specimen and subsequently determine, oh no, this isn't Sarracenia psittacina, it's a different species. And so the beauty to a herbarium specimen is that it's a physical voucher that allows confirmation. And moreover, in this modern age, we now have a capability of extracting DNA from herbarium specimens, and botanists have gotten better and better at this over time. And that means you can start to get at things like population genetics and understanding the evolution of species in place over time, and if there have been plant introductions, whether it was a single genotype and whether you might have interbreeding between introduced genotypes and native genotypes, which I have to say is probably more common than we would like to think. Okay, so that's herbarium specimens. Early floras. Floras are botanist accounts of all of the plant species observed in a particular geographic region at a particular time. And so when we're talking about Florida and the southeastern US, our earliest flora is that of André Michaux, who was the royal botanist for King Louis XVI in France. And Michaux published a flora of North America in 1803. Now, Michaux was based in Charleston, South Carolina, and he spent most of his time traveling in the Carolinas and Georgia, less in Florida. So the more subtropical species that we have in Florida are underrepresented in Michaux's flora because he didn't spend a lot of time here. Time-wise, the next big flora is that of John Torrey and Asa Gray. John Torrey is a very famous botanist who was the New York State botanist, taught at West Point, then went to the Columbia University Medical School, and he trained a whole generation of botanists, including Asa Gray, who became the head of the Botanic Garden at Harvard University. And Torrey and Gray traveled all through the United States, including the Western US as well as the Southeast, and started publishing a multi-volume Flora of North America. However, they never completed it. And what's more, Torrey and Gray only came to Florida to visit very briefly. And with both of them, they came to the Panhandle region to see the genus Torreya, the Torrey pine, which had been named, I mean, not the Torrey pine, the Florida yew, the Florida Torreya. And they both came to see this plant that had been named for Torrey, but they didn't actually spend time collecting and exploring here. So like the Michaux flora, Torrey and Gray's flora doesn't represent our Florida material very well. So then it's really not until 1897, the Flora of the Southern US, that was published by Alvin Wentworth Chapman. Chapman initially, he's a northerner, born in Massachusetts, but he briefly taught in Georgia and then resided in Florida for much of his adult life. And so Chapman really collected extensively in Florida between 1835 and 1899. And what's more, Chapman acted as a host for a number of other botanists, including John Kunkel Small, who was the curator at the New York Botanic Garden. And so Small came to visit Chapman a number of times in Florida. And then this was at a time period when there were no motorized vehicles and no paved roads, right? How cool was that? And Chapman and Small were going out on expeditions through Florida collecting plants together. So for Chapman's Flora, which was published in 1897, and for Small's Flora, which was initially published in 1903, reprinted in 1913, and then very much updated in 1933, those are much more representative of the diversity of plants that we have here in the state of Florida. And I will say with regard to Small's flora is that in 1903, he hadn't visited Florida a lot, so he mostly relied on specimens that had been collected by people like Chapman, whereas by 1933, Small had made many visits and collected a lot himself in the state of Florida. So he had a much fuller understanding and had looked at lots of different habitats in different parts of the state. And so these last two floras on the screen, Chapman and Small's later Manual of the Southeastern U.S., are really valuable references for us to get at whether species are native to Florida and whether these early explorers who were very knowledgeable thought that the plants were native or from context if they thought that they might be introduced. Then we've got naturalist accounts, and naturalist accounts differ from floras in that they're really descriptions of areas without descriptions, without specific enumerations of plant families and species. So what they describe is, oh yeah, I went down the St. Johns River and I encountered this, that, and the other, and under the canopy of high pines, I saw this, that, and the other, but it doesn't have a level of specificity enumerating everything the way you would with a flora. So for our earliest naturalist account that includes Florida is Mark Catesby's Natural History, which was published as a series between 1929 and 1947. But most of his observations were actually made just, I said 1729, 1747. But most of his observations were really made in a 4-year period of time between 1722 and 1726. It just took him time to make these beautiful paintings that he made and to study his work and to get funding to publish it. So a lot of it came out sporadically over the next couple of decades. And what I'll say about Mark Catesby, his work is phenomenal, but he was not really a botanist. And so he spent as much time looking at different types of animals, particularly birds. And also his geographic area was very widespread. So he went into the Bahamas. He spent a lot of time in the Carolinas and in Appalachian areas. And so his view of Florida is fairly limited. He apparently did not actually visit the colonies of East or West Florida, but just explored the adjacent parts of Georgia. So perhaps the Catesby account is really historically interesting, and the artwork is amazing, and I love it, but he didn't spend a ton of time here. Now, the travels of William Bartram. Bartram is very interesting. He was a correspondent of Catesby's, so he had already had information from Mark Catesby, and then he visited Florida with his father, John Bartram, from 1765 to 1766, and that was along the St. Johns River. And then he came back without his father and did further explorations on his own in 1774. So William Bartram covered more of the state, pretty much the northern part of the state. So St. Johns River Basin, Amelia Island, Paynes Prairie, not so much when we get into Central and South Florida, and not so much Panhandle. But again, very interesting ecosystem type observations from these early naturalist accounts. Paleontological and archaeological remains. So paleontology is the study of fossil remains that predate humans. And what you have to know is it's really unusual for plant remains to be fossilized. It is dumb luck and coincidence when you have a plant remain that is in a habitat where it becomes mineralized and preserved. and even more rare when a plant remain becomes preserved in something like amber. So species can be hard to identify because they're often very fragmentary. And sometimes it can be really hard with a fossil to determine if it's really our extant native species or a distinct predecessor or ancestor species, particularly because the material can be so incomplete that you might just have part of a fruit or a leaf, but no flowers. And so you can't really use botanical keys to key it out. So the important thing to remember with fossils is the record's very spotty and coincidental and incomplete. And honestly, the same is true of archaeological remains. Those are the remains that are associated with human habitations. And so most often we are going to see plant remains preserved when they are carbonized. That is, if someone would toss a seed into a fire pit and it can be carbonized and preserved, or in context where the habitation becomes waterlogged, it becomes inundated and cut off from the aerobic bacteria that would break plants down. And so in an anaerobic environment, you would get preservation. And so again, this tends to be a very fortuitous situation where you have a waterlogged canoe in the bottom of a lake or a carbonized seed remain, but it's a very incomplete snapshot. And then the one other thing I have to say with both paleontological and archaeological remains is that things get deposited in strata, in layers, within geographic time. But then there's all these things that happen subsequently that can disrupt those layers, and that can be really hard to get at. So you can have uplift, and you can have digging, and you can have rivers go through and create channels, and all of these can alter the natural strata or layers. And so dating can sometimes be problematic. And so paleontological and archaeological remains of plants have a lot of problems, and you wouldn't want to base an assumption of whether a species is native or introduced just on these types of remains. And so at this point, an example that is really relevant here is that of water lettuce, Pistia stratiotes, and there's a lot of disagreement about whether that species is really introduced or native. It's regulated by the Florida Department of Agriculture as a prohibited aquatic plant. But there is some intriguing, very fragmentary fossil evidence that suggests it might be native to our region. But then again, it's hard to know if that fossil really represents our native species or ancestor species. And so then it's like, I wouldn't say that water lettuce is native just on the basis of fossil evidence alone. I'd want to see some other collaborating evidence. And what's more, even if it is native, is it behaving in a way where it's doing economic or ecological damage that surpasses any ecosystem services that it might provide? Okay, that's paleontological and archaeobotanical remains. Distributional data. So really what I'm getting at here is, what's the broader geographic distribution of a species? Is the distribution contiguous or spotty? And so this can be super useful in getting at widely cultivated species that are really well adapted to disturbed habitats. So in the example, the distribution map that you see on this slide, this is a plant called tropical whiteweed, Azuratum tonizoides. And we see it pretty commonly as increasingly commonly as a weed in disturbed habitats in South Florida, Central Florida. With this species, There seems to be pretty good data to indicate that it's really native to Central America, Mexico, primarily perhaps into Central America. But what you can see from this map, a native range is green, the introduced range is purple. And what you start to get a sense of is that this species is so adaptable to disturbed habitats, and it is so easily distributed because it's got these little tufts of hairs on the achenes or fruits, that it is now widespread throughout the tropics and subtropics. And so then when you see a distribution like this, it makes it very easy to understand. Okay, you see this, and then you're like, okay, could this species actually be native to Florida? And if we saw that it was thought to be native all through Florida and the lower South, like Louisiana and Mississippi, and we started seeing like contiguous ideas of distribution through the Southeast, then maybe people might start arguing that it was native to Florida. But in fact, that's not the case. We're not really finding it in Louisiana and Mississippi. And so it really seems to be based on how widely it's naturalized in other parts of the world that it really is not native to Florida. Okay, I'm going to need to speed up because our time is limited. Habitat preferences. Let me just simply say that a lot of native species are more common in relatively undisturbed habitats, and they can often be very habitat specific. So for example, in this slide, we see wiregrass, which is really adapted to fire-prone pine habitats. And so because of this, disturbances to native habitats often result in losses of native plant species. And then conversely, non-native species are often really most common on very disturbed or disrupted habitats like roadside pastures, fields, urban and suburban landscapes, vacant lots, ditches, and so on. So, of course, non-native species can also invade natural areas, but if a species really predominates in disturbed sites, that often is used by botanists to argue that a species might need to be examined, whether it's really native or not. Okay. So when it comes to evaluating native status, the important thing is to realize that the botanists aren't always in agreement. You can have the Atlas of Florida plants saying that a species is native, and then having Weekly's Flora saying that it's possibly exotic, and having the USDA say something else. So when it comes to plants that are contentious, I would argue that the most robust hypotheses are those that are drawn from multiple lines of evidence, where the person actually looks at herbarium records, they look at early published floras, they look at the travelers' accounts, they look to see is there archaeological and paleontological evidence, they look at distributional and habitat information, and then draw on multiple lines of evidence. If they're just looking at one line of evidence, then I would consider that to be a less robust hypothesis. The other thing to acknowledge is that opinions change over time. Because people discover new specimens that might be in an herbarium in Europe that someone had visited before, and then they get digitized and they're available online. And so our ability to look at the available data is constantly improving. And as we reevaluate this new data, our opinions change. So then this could be very frustrating because you might know a certain plant and have learned it as a native, and then here it is 20 or 30 years later, and here comes some upstart of a botanist arguing that it's not native, and that can be really frustrating. So let's look at some examples. Here on this slide is a plant called wild melon, Cucumis milo. And this is a really interesting plant that shows up in disturbed sites, in particular, in about a third of the counties in the state of Florida. And it's always been assumed to be non-native. The idea was that we had our cultivated cantaloupes, and these were wild types that were reverted. So the cantaloupe had outcrossed through open pollination, and then there were seeds deposited from cantaloupes that decomposed in the field, and they got dispersed by animals, and then you got these little inedible melons, and they were just reverted from the cultivated types. But it's really interesting because in 2002, a USDA specialist who's looking at this family looked at the genetics of these plants and found that they are very close to wild populations from Eastern Asia. And she actually called the populations of the coastal area of the Southeast by a new name and hypothesized that it was probably introduced perhaps intentionally, or perhaps as a contaminant in squash seeds in pre-Columbian times. And so now, when you look at Weekly's flora for this species, they're indicating that it's native to Cucumis milo, whereas you look at the Atlas of Florida plants, I think it's still saying that this species is not native. Okay. So probably a lot of you guys are familiar with this plant. This is the Alamo vine or Noyo vine. It's in the morning glory family. And for a very long time, it's thought to be introduced to Florida. And then Dan Austin, who specialized in the morning glory family, published something in Economic Botany Journal in 2007. And said, hey, Michaud observed this plant in 1773 and mentioned it in his flora. Bartram illustrated it when he explored in 1774. It is native to contiguous areas of the Caribbean. I think there is good data to consider that this plant is actually native to Florida, not introduced. And so now the atlas has changed for this species, changed where it used to be considered exotic. Now it is considered native. Conversely, so many of you guys are familiar with this, the firewheel or blanket flower, or Indian blanket, Gaillardia pulchella. There's been a lot of uncertainty about the status of this plant since the late 19th century. Now, Alan Weekly and a number of colleagues, including our collection manager here at the herbarium at UF, Alan Frank, put together an article that was published in 2020 that say there's no doubt that this species is native to Mexico into the southwestern US, but quite likely probably introduced into the eastern US, particularly when we're talking about east of the Mississippi River. So when we're talking about west of the Mississippi River, quite possibly native. And so what Alan, my colleague who really worked on this, he looked for early herbarium specimens from Florida, and he had a hard time finding them. He did not find good mentions of this in early explorer accounts. And then what he found is there was a lot of confusion between this species, Gaillardia pulchella, and the related species, Gaillardia estivalis. And what he found is a lot of times people were calling things pulchella when really what they were seeing was estivalis, and that he really thinks that, and this is a quote from him, that if this blanket flower was native to the coastal dunes or other habitats of the eastern U.S., particularly Florida, that it would have been observed by these early explorers, people like Bartram, Chapman, Small, and it really seems, based on its how common it is in disturbed habitats and how easily it is disturbed by wind, that it was introduced probably intentionally and then has spread naturally. So the opinion has swung on this, where it was considered native, now considered exotic in Florida. But does it matter? It's tough. It's drought tolerant. The pollinators love it. It's easy for us to grow. It seems to provide ecosystem services. Is there any evidence that it's displacing native species or disrupting habitats? I don't think so. So does it matter that we've changed the status from native to non-native? And I'd argue no. If you're a native gardener and you love this plant, grow it. Okay, here's another plant that's confounded a lot of our gardeners in the southern part of the state. It's the pitch apple or autograph tree, Clusia rosea. This species is definitely native to the Caribbean, southern Mexico, into northern South America. And it's got a long history of cultivation in Florida. It's now cultivated as far north as the Canaveral region and Pinellas County, but its native status in Florida is really uncertain. So when we start looking at herbarium records for the pitch apple, the earliest records we see are from the mid-1900s, as the 1840s, 1850s, and they're only from the Florida Keys, but no other part of the state. And they seem to be very habitat specific, to be in coastal rockland type of habitats. So the idea is that this plant is probably native to the southernmost part of the peninsula, but now it has been introduced through cultivation and it's expanded, and then through human introduction, it has re-escaped to the wild, and we're finding it in different habitats besides those traditional rockland habitats. And so then we've got to be able to have a little more finesse on this, where we say, okay, pitch apple, probably native to the southernmost part of the state, but also probably further introduced, and its range has expanded as a result of cultivation. And then here's one last example that I want to throw out at you. I think there's probably not a gardener in the state of Florida who doesn't know Spanish needles or beggar ticks, Biden's alba. And there's a lot of debate about this species. People either love it because of how it draws in the pollinators and how tough it is, or they hate it because it can be quite aggressive on disturbed soil. So when we look at Biden's alba, what I have to tell you is no one's published. There's no definitive publication on this. I'm just starting to look at the data, and this is what I've come up with. There seems to be little doubt that Biden's alba is native to Mexico, Central America, and the northern part of South America. It's really uncertain in the southeastern U.S. and the Caribbean. And there is no doubt that it is exotic and introduced in the Old World. So in Southern Europe, Asia, Africa, into Australia and the South Pacific, you see it introduced all through the Old World. In the 1803, Flora of Michaud found and described two other species of Biden's, but he did not see Biden's alba in Florida. The earliest specimens that we have are from the 1870s, and they're mostly from very disturbed habitats or coastal areas. And there are some specific early specimens, like one from 1879 up in Philadelphia, where we know it's not native, where the herbarium specimen label specifically suggests that it was introduced as ballast, that is, as a weight in a ship. So soil or water will be used when boats were in port and then dumped, and that's the idea of ballast. What I find particularly damning with regard to Biden's alba is there are actually very old herbarium specimens from multiple locations where this species definitely is not native. So 1840s to 1860s, we have pressed specimens from Hawaii, the Canary Islands, Malaysia, Madagascar, and Australia, but there is nobody arguing that this species is native to any of those areas. So we don't have any specimens from Florida till almost 20 to 30 years after this. And I would argue that there seems to be really good evidence that the Spanish were visiting the native range of this in Central America. And then, particularly because this species has these barbed fruit that can stick on clothing, stick on the hocks of animals. And then the Spanish, of course, were transporting livestock. They had horses, they had cattle, they had pigs, that everywhere where the explorers went or they took their livestock, then Biden's alba also went. And then wherever you have coastal areas that were visited by European explorers, then you have an expansion. So Hawaii, Canary Islands, coastal Africa, coastal Asia, coastal Australia. So if you want to call this species native, I won't argue with you, but I'm beginning to get the feeling that there's good data to say that is potentially introduced. And lastly, you guys know how much this species really loves disturbed habitats, but is relatively uncommon in very pristine, undisturbed habitats. Okay, so we got to wrap this up because I'm running out of time, but just some questions I want to throw out that people often ask with regard to native plants. Are native plants easier to grow than non-native ones? Sometimes. There's an assumption that just because a species is native, that it's better cut out for Florida growing conditions. But you can have things like the sandhill laurel shown on this slide, Kalmia hirsuta, which is just notoriously challenging to propagate and cultivate. So some native species are really adaptable to garden settings and some really aren't. And if you choose to mulch, for example, some native species can be really hard in a mulched habitat because they want to have exposed soil. And so there's a lot of trial and error. So you can't say without reservation that native plant species are easier to grow than non-native ones. The answer to this is sometimes. Are all native plants desirable garden subjects? Again, sometimes. You can have plants like smilax or catbrier, greenbrier, or Virginia creeper, and these are native species that people love to hate because they can be very aggressive in a cultivated circumstance. So, not all native species are necessarily good garden subjects, particularly if you want to have a more manicured garden. Now, if you love a naturalistic habitat type of garden to attract pollinators, you might really like smilax and Virginia creeper. But then if you have other ornamental plants that you want to highlight, it might be hard to keep the smilax and the Virginia creeper from climbing on top of them. Are all exotic non-native species invasive? Definitely not. So the current data, they sometimes call it the rule of 10, is that somewhere about 10% of the exotic species in the state of Florida are demonstrated to be invasive. The figures may be as high as 13 to 15% because our perspective is changing with more time. And we see certain exotic species expanding in range, but certainly there are exotic species that don't seem to be very aggressive under Florida growing conditions. Similarly, there's an assumption that native plants are more likely to be drought tolerant in a garden setting, and that definitely is not the case. When you think about it, here in Alachua County, where I am, our average rainfall per year is between 52 and 58 inches per year. That's a lot of rainfall. So a lot of our species, and we have a lot of wetland habitats. So a lot of our native species, in fact, are very adapted to moist habitats, and they are not necessarily more drought tolerant. So then you need to really be paying attention if you want drought tolerant plants in your garden, that you are selecting a native species that come to areas that are upland, dry, sandy, well-drained, like a sand hill or a coastal dune habitat where the species are in fact very drought tolerant. And then what about buying native plants from nurseries outside of Florida? What's the deal with that? And the question is, you've got to be aware, because native species, there are definitely different genotypes. And if you're buying from a nursery in Carolina or Georgia or Texas, where they're saying a species is native, it may be the same species, but it might actually be a genetically different type from what we have in Florida. And so I'd argue, if this is a concern for you, that you try and find local sources, that people are propagated from known Florida genotypes. Okay, then we've got this topic of nativars. Those are cultivated varieties of native plants. And what I just want you to be aware of is there are varying degrees of genetic modification that we see within nativars. So probably a lot of you guys are familiar with Salvia coccinea, and we have, it's very widespread, and the most common form is red. And then we have a white form, which seems to just be the absence of the red pigment, and it seems very similar in habit, in behavior, as the common wild type, the red form. But now what we're seeing in the horticultural trade is these other nativars that are introduced, like this cultivar Summer Jewel Lavender. And it's beautiful. It's very purple, and the inflorescences are very dense, and the habit of the plant is very compact. And it seems to me that this particular cultivar, although it is beautiful, it behaves so differently from our wild types of Salvia coccinea that there's probably been some pretty extensive genetic modification that's been crossed with other species, or people have otherwise messed with the genetics of it and knocked out genes to make it more compact in habit or more dense for flower stalks. And so if you are planting in a context where nativeness is really of concern, like a native plant demonstration garden or habitat restoration, you probably wouldn't want to select something like Summer Jewel Lavender, and you'd really want to look for demonstrated wild types or cultivars that are very close to wild types. The other thing to be aware of, and I'll just touch on this briefly, is there's lots of outcrossing. So we're all familiar with firebush, Hamelia patens, and there is a subspecies of Hamelia patens that's native to Florida and the Caribbean, but there's also another subspecies that's native to South America. And that subspecies that's native to South America often has a more compact habit. It's got slightly larger flowers that bloom over a longer period of time. And particularly because of its compact habit, it's been introduced by the horticultural trade. And now we've seen outcrossing between the non-native forms of firebush and the native forms. And so Roger Hammer, guru of native Florida wildflowers, published something about this for the Florida Association of Native Nurseries called the Hamelia Mess. And it is truly, in fact, a mess where we've got our native type, an introduced type, and then several different types of hybrids, both with the non-native type and another tropical species, Hamelia cuprea. And so the bottom line is you got to be a buyer beware and really do your homework so you can learn to recognize the distinctive characteristics of a Florida native type. And similarly, with the beach dune sunflower, which is a wonderful species, but what you need to be aware of is there are 3 different geographically distinct subspecies in Florida, one on the East Coast, one on the Southwest Coast, and one on the Panhandle that extends onto the Big Bend area and the Northwestern Peninsula. And they got a different look and different length to the flower stalk and different hair characteristics and other subtle characteristics. But what's happened now is that they've all been introduced into cultivation. And there are some nurseries that are growing them together. And there are some demonstration gardens that are growing them together. And so what we're seeing now is certain beach dune sunflowers that are really hard to key out, and they're developing intermediate characteristics. And the idea is that we probably got some crossing going on. So if you are a East Coast Florida gardener from Brevard County, it really behooves you, if you're concerned about this, to pursue the species that is native to your region and be more of a purist, because over time, what we're getting is a hybrid swarm where the distinction between these different geographic populations is breaking down as a result of us humans cultivating the plant. Okay, so for conclusions, and I apologize for going over, the bottom lines are for some Florida plants, the native status is really uncertain, and we really need more and different types of data to resolve this situation. We also, as gardeners, to be aware of implicit bias in how we use these terms, that we may really be prone to make assumptions that all native species are good when there may be some things that are native and nuisance. And we need to learn to evaluate and manage plants on a case-by-case basis based on how they behave in disturbed habitats that we create so readily. And then when it comes to purchasing, we really want to be aware and inquisitive consumers. And the choices you make when you're purchasing plants are so important, particularly if you're working in habitat restoration, if you're working in a native plant demonstration garden, or if you're a home gardener who's living adjacent to undisturbed natural habitats or preserves. You want to pay attention to the potential impacts that you can have on those natural areas. The other thing I'd like to encourage you to do is not just assume that something that is native to Florida is good in all parts of Florida, because our habitats are very variable from the upper Panhandle down to the southern tip of the peninsula and the Keys. So look at regional limits and distribution and particularly pay attention to habitat. So we are going to be more nuanced in our interpretation, our discussion of native plants, and our success in growing native plants when we ignore geographic boundaries and really emphasize habitat and ecological relationships. So more and more, I'd like to see us moving towards a discussion of, instead of saying this species is native to northern and central Florida, saying this species is native to dry, sandy habitats of the northern and central peninsula. And so with that, let me just remind you that there's lots of good information on the subject of native plants from UF IFAS. There's a good overview of this subject from Jeff Norsini. Of course, the Florida Native Plant Society and the the Florida Wildflower Foundation, all fabulous web-based resources. And then we are very fortunate that there is no shortage of good field guides. So my predecessor at the UF Herbarium, David Hall, has a great wildflowers guide. Roger Hammer has published multiple guides, including specific guides for the Keys and the Everglades. Gil Nelson has guides for woody plants, ferns, and trees. And then we've got nice ecologically based or habitat-based guides and discussions of ecology from Bob Simons and Walt Taylor. And then Gil Nelson and Rufino Osorio have both made really good gardener's guides. So we are fortunate here in Florida relative to other states to have a wealth of published resources that we can refer to. And with that, I know we're over, but if there is time, I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was just phenomenal. And the feedback in the chat is echoing that. It's such a in-depth topic to cover in, just an afternoon webinar. So we really appreciate your time and thoroughness with that presentation. We only have a handful of questions that we don't have time to address this afternoon, but we will follow up with folks via email.
Excellent.
For all attendees, this was recorded, so if you registered, you'll get a link when it is available online. So thank you again, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their week.
Thank you. And again, I apologize for eating up so much of your time.
I don't think anybody minded, Mark. There's so much good information.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.
You too. Bye.